that you can have hybrids produced. You can also have two identical corals that can be produced as a primary hybrid or a secondary backcross. Two identical corals, a taxonomist names it, gives it a name, but their parents may be very different. So in effect, they aren't really the same species. And that's an interesting concept. Now, you might say, well, why does this happen? I thought that, species try to segregate. What's the advantage? And the term is outcrossing. Mixing one's genes with a more distantly related, but still related mate. Increases vigor, health, variation in the offspring gives them a better ability to adapt to changes in the environment. A recent paper talking about hybridization in corals had a few important comments. One is that hybridization has been shown to be instrumental in the formation of new species, creating greater diversity. Coral hybrids also give the coral the ability to live in a novel place, so they can establish a reef in a new environment where the corals couldn't grow before. That would be adapting to changes in perhaps temperature or salinity or other factors. Hybridization may be more frequent at peripheral boundaries. That's kind of common with the concept of hybridization in general. And then the more important comment that hybridization is significant as an important consideration for the future resilience of coral reefs and should be taken into consideration as a conservation strategy. For example, when I mentioned hybridization, we should also include the idea of maintaining genetic diversity within species. You have, in a given species, you have different forms. You might take a look at that, and looking at people, you have people who are blonde, brunette, dark skin, light skin, many different varieties. In corals, you can have a single species with many different genetic forms. And sometimes if the two forms are identical, they have low fecundity. If they produce eggs and sperm together, make an offspring, the survival can be lower. But if you have within the same species two different forms breeding, then you get good vigor. And so it's important for conservation strategies, if reef restoration is done, to look at the genotypes of the corals within the same species. Okay, another comment on coral spawning. Mass coral spawning occurs at a particular time, which is typically the longest day length and the hottest time of year. Now, that happens to be the same time that corals bleach and die. So you might say, well, why are they spawning at this time when they are least likely to survive? Well, the answer to that is somewhat obvious, that it's a form of selection. Those larvae that do survive are selecting for more vigor. So you combine hybridization plus timing, that it's happening at the time when the corals are most stressed, you're producing the hardiest corals. This isn't an accident. I should mention also that not all corals participate in mass spawnings, and in different regions they don't spawn en masse. And it has to do with those stressful conditions. It's always in the places where the corals are most likely to be stressed, bleach, and die that you do have these mass spawnings. Okay. So let's get back to the topic of sex. Sex on the beach. This is a photograph of limulus, the horseshoe crab or king crab. You have them here in Asia. We have a different species in the eastern coast of the United States. And I studied them when I was a graduate student at the University of Florida. And the way they spawn, out in the seagrass beds or shallow zones near the shore, around the full moon, when you have greater tidal range, the larger crabs are females, smaller ones are males, and a male will find a female and he'll grab onto the back of her carapace. He has little special claws that allow him to do that. And he latches on, won't let go, and they come up onto the shore because the tide's really high. They'll climb up really to the high tide line and spawn. Now, there are a lot more males than there are females in these populations. So you have males that never find a mate. and they are referred to as satellite males. So when I was a graduate student, we were studying this because one of the professors in the biology department had been watching this, and she thought it was a good example of what's called sperm competition. So these satellite males would sort of try to get in on the action when the one in line was spawning, and her hypothesis was that some of their sperm were probably fertilizing the eggs of the female. Well, at that time, this was back in 1986 and 87, there really wasn't good paternity test DNA analysis available, but now there is, and recent papers by this professor have shown that on average 40% of the eggs are fertilized by satellites compared to roughly 60% of the male who's the one clasping on. That's pretty impressive. So that means that the sperm just drifting around in the water are able to fertilize these eggs.